everyone. So like Jen mentioned, I'm the executive director of the Council of Agencies Serving South Asians. And just a little bit about CASA before I get into my presentation. So we are a social justice umbrella organization. And what that means is we serve organizations that serve South Asian communities in the province of Ontario. And we're currently in the process of actually expanding as a national organization. So we're very fortunate and excited about the crossroads that we're on right now in terms of our expansion and also in terms of our partnerships with organizations like CCNC-SJ and others. And we've done a lot of work around anti-racism, anti-hate, and recently started to do a lot more work on solidarity and allyship. So my presentation is based on our experience and our work, and obviously in no way encompasses all experiences of allyship and solidarity and what it means to different racialized and Indigenous communities. So just wanted to put that caveat out there. Before I get into the nitty gritty, this is usually typically a longer presentation, and we do spend some time getting to know each other because I also feel that it's an important part of training to be able to vocalize and understand our identities and our social locations, and that helps us understand different themes and topics that we're going to be talking about today. But in the interest of time, maybe we'll just have folks participate via chat. Just to have you understand where I'm coming from as I'm making this presentation. And I also mentioned at the beginning that it is based on my experience and the experience of my organization, the organization that I work for, and it's not necessarily supposed to encompass experiences and the understanding of what solidarity and allyship means to all communities. So for me, there's certain identities, identity markers, and social locations that I carry as a person, and I like to make that known, so that obviously with everything that I'm saying, there is a certain world view and experience that I carry. There might be certain biases that I carry, so I just like to make it known that there's certain identities such as me being a South Asian Muslim woman, being a settler on Turtle Island, being a mother, and also being a leader in the South Asian community. So there's certain power and certain privilege that I carry within each of these identities. There are certain situations and certain environments where I have greater power and privilege because of these identities, whereas in other situations, I may not have as much power and privilege and I may be of a disadvantage. So it's always good to be and analytical about what kind of identities you carry and what it means for you as you go through different experiences in life. One of the things that I wanted to focus on today as we talk about solidarity and allyship, and I was mentioning before the presentation started, is this topic is very uncomfortable and difficult for racialized communities, particularly to understand, because typically when we think about racism or hate, we feel like we're the victims of it, and oftentimes we are being oppressed by various communities and people. But then in this presentation, we challenge people to think about ourselves as also potentially oppressing certain groups. So what lateral violence means, so we use the definition that's in the American Institute on Domestic Violence. It's an organized harmful behaviors that we do to each other collectively as part of an oppressed group within our families, within our organizations, and or within our communities. And another word for lateral violence is horizontal violence. There's actually not much written on lateral or horizontal violence when it comes to inter-race relations. It's more so, like I mentioned, on domestic violence. But there are certain discussions that that are being held now, like the one that we're having today in progressive spaces, especially around racism within racialized communities. So we've seen and we've heard from communities about issues of anti-Black racism in the South Asian communities, and we've seen and heard about issues of Islamophobia in Asian and South Asian communities. So it's good for us to be advocates against those kind of harms and oppressions, but it's also good for us to do that education within our communities. So in the context that we're talking about today, lateral or horizontal violence can be negative attitudes and biases of one racialized community that it holds against another. And it could even be within the same racialized community or even a religious community. So for example, me being, as I indicated before, as a Muslim woman, there are many different segments of the Muslim population and different beliefs within this Muslim population. And so we've all also seen communities make judgments and oppress one segment of the Muslim population towards another. So it could be within one racialized or religious community, or it could be between communities. And another form of lateral violence that we've seen a lot in South Asian communities and even in the Black community is something called shadeism, or you may also know it as colorism. So shadeism and colorism is basically discrimination based on the shade of one's skin. And thanks to colonialism, many people of color have carried the notion that being lighter skin is somehow better and more beautiful than having darker skin. So that kind of violence we see within within one racialized community or ethnic community. So we've also seen in terms of lateral violence and the impact of colonialism on lateral violence towards Indigenous populations. So there's so many myths and negative attitudes of Indigenous communities that I personally can say as a South Asian person that I've heard and seen in our communities, and I'm sure based on my conversation with colleagues and research that it also exists in other racialized communities. We've heard things like they have it so good because Indigenous communities don't have to pay taxes, or they cause themselves to be stuck in poverty through addictions and drugs. And so all of this narrative, which is brought on by colonialism, is very harmful. And we often, you probably heard of the term model minority myth. We often do this because we as racialized communities want to be closer to whiteness than other communities. So we start to kind of scapegoat other communities, and we use these terms of oppression towards other communities so that we could be the ones that are in closer proximity to whiteness and to white culture. So one of the things that I wanted to do in terms of getting people to participate is so these are various different terms and notions that we hear in the work of solidarity, allyship, anti-racism, anti-hate. I'm just going to ask folks if they want to choose two terms from this tree. And as you can see, it's a tree, and in the roots of this tree, we have the word colonialism in there. So a lot of these oppressions and these forms of racism and discrimination are rooted in colonialism. So some of the terms included here are anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, homophobia, sexism, transphobia, ableism, discrimination, Islamophobia, oppression, racism, ageism, anti-immigration, shadeism, and colorism. So if you feel comfortable and if you feel safe, just feel free to type it in the chat. what you could pick one or two of these terms and tell us what it means to you, and just let us know what it doesn't have to be a dictionary definition, but maybe something that you can relate to, and something that has had an impact on you, something that you've had experiences with, and you can let us know what it means to you. So I'll move to the next slide. So moving into what allyship is. So the reason why I went into this background about lateral violence and about the model minority myth is to help you understand the danger of buying into this narrative. Because despite what people think, even if you are kind of the closer proximity to whiteness at a certain time, you will still face systemic racism and white supremacy and other forms of racism, and hate can still harm your communities and harm you as an individual. So there's no success in trying to be a model minority, or in trying to make other communities racialized or Indigenous communities, and trying to oppress them in order to raise your own status. So there's no benefit to you, and obviously no benefit to the communities that you're oppressing. And so moving beyond that, so that's kind of the lowest standard of practicing solidarity and allyship, is not practicing lateral violence and not passing judgments and creating stereotypical comments towards other communities. So that is the lowest form of how you can practice solidarity and allyship with other communities. But really, acting on solidarity and allyship is something that we want to encourage and promote in this presentation. And we like to share this diagram here with what it means to be a good ally. So with allyship comes action, listening, learning, and yielding. So in action, allyship involves action, support, and solidarity with those who are marginalized. It also involves you showing up and supporting anti-oppression movements and taking on teachable moments in your own communities. Respectfully listening to the marginalized people or groups. So listening means listening to the marginalized people or groups in order to build mutual trust and consent. So I'll go over the allyship again. So there's 4 aspects of allyship. The first is action, the second is listening, the third is learning, and the fourth is yielding. And what action means is to involves supporting and displaying solidarity with those who are marginalized. It also means that you show up and you support movements. So whether it's for other racialized communities, like the Black Lives Matter movement or Latin back movements with Indigenous communities, or you take on teachable moments in your own community. So you've learned something, and then now you go to your own communities and you educate and you share your experiences with your own community, so that they may also change their perspectives and they may also take action. Listening, so respectfully listening to marginalized communities or groups in order to build their trust and consent. Learning, so this is a point of contention with a lot of people, because when we learn, we want to do it in a respectful way. And oftentimes what I've seen is communities that are trying to learn from Indigenous communities or from Black communities put the burden of learning entirely on those communities, and want to be able to learn everything without doing much effort from themselves. So really being mindful of putting on more burden on those communities for your learning, because there's already so much resources and information and content that you can find in many different places if you want to learn about history and the positionality of different struggles and of different privileges that different groups have had over the course of time. If you want to learn about that, there's already a lot of resources. Just be mindful of not putting the labor and the burden of your learning on those marginalized communities, because it can get even more oppressive for those communities. And then yielding. So you avoid monopolizing, overtaking, speaking, or patronizing, romanticizing, or even agenda setting on behalf of those communities that you're trying to be an ally for. What that means is sometimes we see we have good intention and we come into a circle where we're trying to support, for example, Indigenous communities, and then we tell them what we feel like they need for us to do, right? So we don't listen, we don't learn, we just take over the space, we start to set the agenda, and then we expect to get recognition and support for the work that we've done. So really stepping back and analyzing what our intentions are, and letting those communities tell us what they need from us, and not assuming what they need from us. So some examples that I can give in terms of practicing allyship is we should find out where Black, Indigenous, and other racialized communities need our support and how they would like to be supported. So like I said, there's a lot of resources out there that are widely available by both racialized communities and Indigenous communities. So the burden of educating allies does not necessarily fall on the racialized communities or Indigenous communities that need that support. And then when we talked about the model minority myth, it's very important to recognize that if we are practicing that, or if we know people that are practicing it and are trying to be allies at the same time, we have to align with the biggest challenge that both Black and Indigenous communities face, which is systemic racism. So no racialized communities will come on top as long as we have, the current structures and systems in place that favor certain communities over others. So once we have these two things down, we have to show up, we have to act, we have to endorse, support, and connect. Whatever else it is that is needed from us as allies. So all of this, the learning, the action, the yielding, once we have a good understanding of that, then we show up and we act. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about briefly is the types of allyship. So like I mentioned, in certain circles, we've seen and experienced people that become allies because that's kind of the sexy thing to do at that time. We've seen that a lot during after the murder of George Floyd, when there was a lot of attention being given to Black Lives Matter movement. There were people practicing allyship for the sake of getting attention, or for kind of satisfying their own desires, and not for the benefit of those communities that were struggling. So I came across in a training that I took, I believe it was from the Mosaic Institute, but I can't remember 100%. So these are not my terms, but it was a term that really stuck to me. And it was the difference between transactional allyship versus relational allyship. And what that means is, a transactional allyship is when we are seeing kind of, this is the thing that everybody's focusing on right now, and it's very self-serving to make us look good, and it's very temporary, and we're doing this to kind of satisfy our own egos and our own the way that we are portrayed in our communities, versus relational allyship, which is something more something that has good intention. And when we are showing up when there is a need, and we are continuing to support those communities in very meaningful ways. And we are, we're not just showing up and disappearing when we please. We're there as kind of permanent support systems for those communities. And it's not just an immediate thing. And we're not expecting every time that we show up for those communities that need us to explain what their problem is, and to so we have a good understanding already of the issues and what is needed from us. So really practicing the form of allyship that is not self-serving, and really looking at your intentions for being allies is a critical part in practicing solidarity and allyship. An example of a program that CASA had, in which we really worked with Indigenous communities, and we wanted to build a relationship of trust and a long-term relationship with them, is a program that we had a couple of years ago called the Indigenous Environmental Justice Program. And through that program, we wanted to educate South Asian communities about what Indigenous environmental justice was, and have them support environmental justice causes. And we worked mostly with seniors and with youth, because we found that especially those that were immigrants to Canada didn't have a good understanding of the struggles of Indigenous communities. And so we provided them a lot of that education, and we provided them connections to the Indigenous communities. And then we provided them ways for them to actually act and actually support those communities. The exercise that I usually do in these kind of training sessions, which is really an important way to understand our own biases, if we have them, and our own power and privilege. So before I do that, there's some comments in the chat. In the colonialism trees, Rose picked oppression. So she defined it as it's used as a tool to reinforce the powers behind colonialism. It creates the idea of the colonizer and the others. Colonizers oppress the others through various barriers, such as racism, discrimination, that are deeply rooted in our society. I feel like it's important to identify these factors in our daily lives and find ways to unlearn the oppression. Thanks so much for sharing that, Rose. And Grace picked ableism. Of course, that includes outright insults and excluding people from spaces, but also institutions are created by and for people who do not have disabilities. So it is much more difficult for people with disabilities to simply exist in these spaces than prioritize profit and productivity. In post-secondary, for example, in post-secondary, you have to seek accommodation to be able to get the same opportunity to learn as everyone else. And often these accommodations require a lot of labor on the part of the disabled person, and they encounter many barriers to getting what they need. So thank you so much, Grace and Rose, for providing those definitions. But just lastly, wanted to quickly go over the Power Flower exercise. And if you want to do that on your own time, like, I encourage you to do that. It's very meaningful. So basically, what it does is it explores how certain groups can be socially dominant groups that have certain powers socially, economically, and politically. And their power and their privilege can either be visible or invisible. And so each of these petals has a group. In the inner group, you would list within education, which is the non-dominant group. And in the upper petal, you would list within that group, which is the dominant group within this setting. So there's different types of identities and settings, such as geographic region, sexual orientation, gender, race, ethnic group, language, religion, family status, social class, ability, age group, education, body type, and other. So for example, in gender, we may say that people that are gender conforming may have just male or female gender, or even just male gender, have certain privileges in society that women and other non-conforming genders don't have. So this is a good exercise to think about and to go through each petal. And this will help you kind of understand different communities and different groups struggles and how they're marginalized. So and then the next time you're interacting with those individuals and groups, you'll be mindful of how you interact with them. And you know, and if you have certain biases towards them, it may help you kind of overcome those biases and interact with them in a more respectful and fair way.
Yeah, so the title of my presentation that I wanted to share with you is actually titled 4 I's: Informed, Involved, Invested, and Inspired. I know in the last couple of sessions and with your previous speaker, there is different paradigms and definitions of allyship that's already been shared. And I'm not a theorist, so I won't get into too many of those discussions, but I thought that when I was reflecting on my journey and some of the examples of community partnerships that I've been involved in, I came up with these 4 words. And it's not about the I as in me, it's really more about how these actually, I think, complement some of the other framework that has been mentioned to you before. And I wanted to ground our sharing, or my sharing of the examples through those 4 words. But before we do that, I will actually take some time to talk about the I, as in me, so that we can get to know each other a little bit better. This drawing is actually done a few years ago as a school project of a daughter of one of my colleagues at work, so who interviewed me and then had to draw a cartoon version of me. So some of the highlights are captured. And this is a write-up in 1995, which is like almost 30 years ago. That was when I was the president of CCNC. And I think that was actually, there is a story behind this write-up, but I won't go into it for now. But I guess the main thing I wanted to highlight was that it talks about how I practice medicine, how I see the practice of medicine tying to the equity and access issues, and how social systems impact health, and how my experience as a marginalized sexual minority impact my awareness and sensitivity toward other marginalized communities. It also showed me in my opera diva outfit, which was one of my hobbies back in the days when I could still sing the soprano, which I no longer can. But I think it's significant because that was actually the first time that I actually openly came out in the Chinese media. And that was also, I think, for the history of the Chinese Canadian community, that was the first time a so-called mainstream Chinese Canadian group leader, quote unquote, came out as an LGBTQ person. So before we go into more stories, I wanted to hear a little bit from your perspective. Who do you think needs an ally? So if you can put that in the chat, that would be most helpful. It doesn't need to be long. It just could be, like a few words of, it could be person, it could be issues, it could be groups that you think might need and benefit from an ally. Can you do that in the chat? So we'll give you a couple minutes to do that. Just to want to make sure that we are all still here. There's no right or wrong answers. LGBTQ community needs allies. Yes. Who else might need allies? Everyone needs allies. Yeah. Undocumented immigrants. Yeah. So then my next question or invitation to share is about who is your first ally? I think as Snowden has mentioned, everyone probably needs an ally at some point in their lives or on some issues that we care about. So I would like us to reflect a little bit and maybe share in the chat if you feel comfortable. Who was your first ally? And while you're doing that, just to be equitable and vulnerable, and sharing with you, I'll share stories about my first ally that I can remember. So when I was growing up, I've been teased and bullied quite a lot by the more macho boys in class about being effeminate in my manners. So one of the favorite pranks they would like to do to me was trying to take down my pants in the classroom and to see if I'm indeed a boy. So I used to defend myself and survive by being like the smartest student in class, or to provide favors to other people by loaning other boys comic books or kung fu novels, or helping them with their homework. But all of those never seems to stop the teasing, until one day a couple of boys actually succeeded in pulling my pants down in classroom, and I decided I need to fight back. So you can see that was me when I was in my early teens. And then, so I decided to fight back, not quite as dramatic as what happened in the movie Moonlight, but I did rally up the support of another little guy who also get bullied quite a bit. And then we cornered the top bully into the washroom and put down his pants to repay his favor. After that, the bullying actually stopped and eased off. So that was my story of my first ally that I built, and it was out of necessity for survival, I think. So I can read some of the chats. So the question, well, actually, Grayson has a question. Can you confirm whether you mean first, as in first time I experienced having an ally, or you mean first as in my best? I guess the first time as you experiencing an ally. So that was my first ally, literally, chronologically. It may not be the best ally. I'm going to show a couple more examples that I think I had like really good allies through the years. So I would encourage us to continue sharing. I'm also just cognizant of time, and I do want to make sure that we have workshop times towards the end. So please do feel free to continue to put in examples of your chat. And then I wanted to also invite you to share what courses have you needed partnership and allyship for in your lives on the issues that you care about. So maybe these two questions can kind of go together. It may not be the first time you need an ally. It could be ongoing courses you needed allies for, but that would be something to think about as we ground our sharing and discussion about allyship. So again, there's no right or wrong answers. So maybe you can think about, any courses or any examples in your life that you've needed allies for, or you needed to build partnerships to advance, so that we can, maybe connect a little bit more about some of the common issues. Rallies and petitions, on any of the particular issues you can think about. Anti-Asian racism. I guess one of have any of us signed like the change.org kind of petition on different issues? Or organized any rallies or joined any rallies in the, But I wanted to pay tribute to two examples in my life that I had the privilege of being part of the experience for. And the first example I want to share is to illustrate the power of allyship through the work of a project we call the Coalition Against Homophobia. So to give you context, this project started in 1996. That year, the Gay Asians Toronto, which is a community group in Toronto, published an oral history book on Gay Asians called Celebration Share Lives. And just another anecdote, Gay Asians Toronto actually was formed on the same year that CCNC was formed in Canada, 1980. But of course, many more people know about CCNC and very few people know about Gay Asians. But that year, 10 Gay Asians, including myself, shared their oral history and published the book and was released. This was the press conference. And then the same year, we won the Pride Award with the most outstanding float in the Pride Parade. We did a balloon dragon, as you can see in the background. So it was a really high, excited years for us. But a week later, we have a parent coming. So one of the parents actually of one of the guys in the book actually came to our office and show us this tabloid from the Chinese community, which is given out free in restaurants, in community centers and stuff, which has the title saying, "Do people afflicted with homosexuality deserves to have pride?" And this tabloid goes into like a whole full feature about how pathological gay and lesbians are, and why would they even have pride, and how can they be showcasing and celebrating it, and why as a community we should really be watchful for these infectious disease. So I thought that was really quite intense for us to have the issue raised to us by a parent of a gay Asian, because for many years, many of us developed the community because we didn't have very supportive families, right? So for the parents to really care enough to raise this issue for us, it really mobilized and galvanized our energies to begin to organize a coalition of efforts. And then for the next couple of weeks, we flooded the fax machines. Well, in those days, we do fax machines, right? We don't have social media so much. So we've flooded the newspapers, fax machines. We have public health, we have government, we have community leaders, we have agency representatives, we have community members calling their office, complaining, tell them that they're wrong. And then we threatened to sue them with a libel lawsuit. So as a result, 2 weeks later, 2 or 3 weeks later, they actually published a formal apology. This is a press conference where we released their official apologies. So this says in their front page, given us the same coverage to say to the lesbian gay communities, their families and friends, we were wrong and we are sorry. And it showcased a whole issues with features of equal coverage that covered and sharing our perspectives from the LGBTQ community. And it also showcased a lot of supportive comments and remarks from different allies in our community. And the reason I share this story is not just to make us feel good, and then after that, we actually galvanized a broader LGBTQ communities of various ethno-racial background who also experienced the same kind of homophobia and oppression from their own community media. And so we came together, the Jewish community, the Polish community, the Black community, the Italian community, actually formed a coalition against homophobia. And we launched this campaign called Love Embraces All, which is a poster campaign, an educational workshop campaign that actually get work and shared around the city. And a lot of the posters are probably still in some government offices. It was up in City Hall, it was up in schools and housing projects in community centers for quite a few years. So this is an example how allyship actually worked very powerfully to address a discrimination that a marginalized community like the gay Asian community experienced. But to enable that to happen, we actually have gone through a whole process of evolution that involved being informed, informing others, and getting involved. So just to give specific context, like as I said, Gay Asians Toronto was formed the same year as CCNC, and building that community create a home base necessary for communities to get organized, right? So if you don't have a home base, it's impossible to even build partnerships because you're all alone, we are all isolated. And then, but for many years, gay Asians are not visible to the mainstream Chinese Canadian community until the AIDS crisis in the late 80s, when we really had to step up and be visible in order to survive. Because when funding and government resources are available, they would only give it to mainstream established agencies. And so gay Asians was never incorporated, it was never visible. And then all the funding went into big settlement agencies in the Chinese Canadian community. And then we tried to get them to respond to the needs of the people actually living with and affected by HIV, and they have absolutely no interest. And they have no awareness or skill or capacity or motivation to do that. So after really trying to work and build partnership for over a year, while my friends and other community members are dying, we decided we have to organize our own project. So as a result, we developed the Gay Asian AIDS project. And that was actually the only project in Canada that has gay in its name. And it was stigmatizing, it was taboo for many of us, but we had to do this because to tell people that this is the community sector or portion component that is not being serviced, because the city won't fund us until we prove that the other projects that you funded doesn't care about us and didn't serve us. So over time, we built bigger and bigger coalitions and formed the Asian Community AIDS Services, which is actually a merger of 3 different Asian-based HIV services in the Chinese and Asian communities. But we also have built partnerships as Gay Asians Toronto with other racialized groups, such as the Black group called Samya and South Asian group called Klush. And then this is a picture, or this is a coverage from a newsletter in 1985 when Debbie Douglas and Doug Stewart, who's one of the 2 LGBTQ activists, on an anti-racism workshop to protest about a racist sex ad in the mainstream gay newspaper about advertising for Black houseboys. So we had to fight racism in the gay community, who feel that sexual liberation trumps every other oppression, and that is the paramount issues that they only care about. And then we also get involved with mainstream settlement agencies, such as the C Center. At that time, it was called Southeast Asian Service Center. Now it has been renamed Support something Access Center. But anyway, so by getting involved with them, which was actually close to where I work at Regent Park, I got to know Amy Goh, who was actually the president of CCNC National at that time. And she got me involved with CCNC. And then part of the reason she invited me to join was that at that time, CCNC actually declined to sign a petition to support the passing of anti-discrimination law against sexual orientation. So she was really indignant, and she really wanted to have more inclusivity and participation from the LGBTQ community. So when I met her as fellow board member on the C Center, she invited me to join CCNC. And so those are us in our 20s, which is like almost, that was like a good 30 some years ago. So anyhow, all this, and then I got involved with CCNC, of course. I think you have many opportunities to learn about the work of CCNC against W5 and Het Test Redress and Exclusion Act campaign and all that. So all that is to say that by building those partnerships, we had an opportunity to inform others of our struggles, of our issues. But we also first has to really listen and learn about the issues of concern about the other partners, right? And then we actually rolled up our sleeves and be part of that community and be part of that coalition. So by being informed and involved, we actually build meaningful partnerships. So when it came to times of need, that generated results and a solid community collaborative action. So next, I want to share another example of how we can invest it and get inspired by community partnership. And that I want to share the examples of CAT. CAT, as I think it goes into our introduction, is the Committee for Accessible AIDS Treatment. It was formed in 1999 to reduce barriers faced by people living with HIV/AIDS, and we call like short form PHAs, who are immigrants, refugees, or without status in Canada. And we have a coalition of over 40 agencies and individuals living with HIV. And we do community education research, service coordination, advocacy. So to give you some context of the need and the challenge facing CAT, we need to understand how the HIV movement evolved in Canada. It was initiated through a lot of community activism for mostly gay men initially. So many of the people in leadership positions are gay men within the community. And over the years, the movement has become much more professionalized and grassroots and becomes very service-oriented rather than activism-focused, right? But the populations affected and living with HIV also changed over the years, from gay white men to people of color, to newcomers, to people using drugs, to people who are facing other marginalization. And then over time, it made up bigger and women, right? So over time, these changes the demographics, and it became an underclass within the HIV sector that faced major access barriers in getting healthcare support, settlement needs, and access to trades and profession. So the challenge for us as a coalition is how to effect positive changes when the affected communities are so marginalized and not having access to any power structure, so that the federal government doesn't care. The provincial government said immigration is a federal issue, and the federal government said that healthcare is a provincial issue. So nobody cares, and this group is being kicked around like a human football. So in these circumstances, it's important to recognize their possibilities in the third space, in evidence-based advocacy. So this is actually the only kind of theoretical thing I mentioned. So the third space is actually rooted in critical post-colonial and race theories, refers to the dynamic space between the center and the margins, where historically oppressed or socially excluded communities can dialogue, interact, and develop new thinking, hybrid cultures, and innovative practices that challenge the status quo. So how do we invest in the community? So we build structural support to make sure that affected community has the capacities to participate and to represent themselves. So it doesn't mean that we are the experts and they are ignorant and doesn't need the knowledge, or doesn't have the knowledge. It's about providing that capacities and resources and avenue for people to showcase their capacities, right? And also creating opportunity for equitable and progressive engagement, and having the paradigm for mutual learning and collaboration. So it's not about experts telling people what to do, and to have a vision for community succession. And then privileging community with lived experience as knowledge ambassadors and change agents. So I won't go into all this because time is short, but over time, CAT has done all these different projects and research from studying about basic healthcare access barriers to really mobilizing community and dealing with stigma against HIV and building community champion. But throughout this journey, what we've learned is that we can change challenges into opportunities and strategies. So for example, our community lacked the status and are really scared and unable to self-advocate, because if people have no status, they are worried about deportation. If HIV is so stigmatized, people doesn't want to disclose. So the first thing we need to do is to build equitable partnerships via joint frontline programs and projects, and to make sure during those opportunities, we honor those voices and input from people. So people experience a lot of access barrier in getting their basic needs met. So in order to facilitate meaningful participation, people must have an opportunity to attend to their care needs first. So we want to make sure anything we do, especially in research, leads to concrete, tangible services that are beneficial and meet the needs of the community, rather than just generate knowledge for the sake of knowledge and for academics to write papers and things like that. And then we need to make sure that the language of the services are accessible, as well as helping people to have that health literacy to access the system. So then to deal with the multi-systemic discrimination, we need to ensure that all our work has community empowerment and succession planning in place, right? So just to give an example, in research setting, for example, the traditional paradigm is that people are participants, or we consult them. And then we, as service providers or experts or academics or professionals, we then develop all these things. But we don't do that. We make sure that people are not just participants, they actually co-investigate, they actually co-develop the recommendations, but more so they become the knowledge ambassador. They are the speakers, and they are the people who goes to government deputation. They are the people who actually meet with policymakers to negotiate resources and changes. So we have made a commitment with our community that every single presentation CAT does in public will involve a person with lived experience as a speaker. And that wasn't very easy because a lot of people were actually very scared. And a lot of time when people invite people to conferences and big forums and government tables, they really just invite the professionals or the experts. So we have to really proactively making sure we share space and give value and give voices and give our own seats away to make sure that people with lived experience are first and foremost at the front of the table. So that's actually a very inspiring community experience, because throughout the last 20 years, CAT has evolved from a provider-driven network to a people living with HIV-led network. We've nurtured a whole generation of PHA leaders. Many of them has now PhD degrees. Some of them has become executive directors of organizations, and many of them has formed national, even international organizations. CAT is now recognized as a provincial resource on HIV and immigration, and we've developed many innovative programs for racialized and newcomer communities that has been recognized as wise practices or best practices in the sector for advancing JIPA-MIPA, which is the greater involvement and the meaningful engagement of people living with HIV/AIDS. So, and the very latest thing is that CAT is now incorporated as an independent organization with majority people living with AIDS in the leadership position. So just to share the two last pictures, this is an award that we got from the city for advancing access and equity. And this is actually a multi-sector think tank that brought together many people from different racialized, different background, academic, research, service provider, people with lived experience, community groups, activist groups all together to brainstorm and develop a research agenda on HIV and immigration a few years ago. So this has been a really privileged journey that I was able to be part of, and I learned a lot from, living through and learning alongside many of our community members. So I thought that would be an experience I really wanted to share with you.
Thanks so much for having me, and I'm glad to be here. For me, it's tonight. So I am actually based in South Africa. I live between Mokenstis or Calgary, Alberta, and South Africa. And so it's a late one for me, but I'm really glad to be here. Jen had invited me quite some time ago. And so I wanted to still come. So welcome, everybody. I guess I will introduce myself first before I jump into my slides. So yeah, I'm Lyndi Wu. I use the pronouns she and her. I am a settler of Chinese descent. I'm going to speak from my positionality as a Chinese Canadian. And so for me, I was born and raised on Treaty 7 territory, which is also known as Mokenstis or Calgary, Alberta. That is the territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, including the Kainai, Siksika, and Piikani nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina and Métis, Tsuut'ina nations and Stoney Nakoda nations, and home to the Métis Nation Region 3. And so, land acknowledgements are a really interesting piece because we can talk about them, but what do they mean, right? And for me, it is important to continually reflect on how I connect to the land around me, how I connect to the people around me, the importance of just, I guess, understanding the history of the land around me and, where I am in that current moment. That includes here in South Africa and, who inhabited the land where I am now before me, and, what is my responsibility with that knowledge. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, about knowledge and responsibility as we continue on. And so, right, land acknowledgements, they are important. And I think the more important piece is to ask ourselves, why are we doing them? And what does it mean? What are the actions behind them? What is the work that I am doing in relation to making those land acknowledgements? So, that's an important piece that can kind of frame the bits that I'm talking about as I move forward. Some other bits about me. I am Canadian-born Chinese, and on my dad's side, I'm first generation born in Canada. On my mom's side, I'm third generation, right? It kind of depends what side of my family we're looking at, but pretty like multi-generational in that way. And so, that forms a lot of my identity and my experience and how I grew up, in terms of, yes, being connected to culture in certain ways, and at the same time, not being able to speak my language. And so that is a loss of connection in certain ways, and how that has contributed to my identity, how I see myself as Chinese Canadian, and also through the years, how I have been able to claim that or not claim that. And connects to my experiences of anti-Asian racism as well, and the work that I'm currently doing. So, I'm talking about these pieces as identity again, because it's going to connect to what I want to talk about in terms of allyship and partnership, and what it means to work in allyship and work side by side with communities that I don't necessarily share a racial identity with. I know some of you here tonight are, I think, studying at OISE, as far as Janice shared with me. So I am also an OISE graduate. I have a master's of education in adult education and community development. And so shout out to all you OISE folks out there. Jen mentioned that, I've done work in Ghana and Nicaragua, Thailand and Cambodia. And those pieces also allowed me to work in partnership with communities that maybe I didn't share a racial identity with, or maybe I, as a Canadian, like going over to Southeast Asia, I hold a lot of privilege. Going down to Nicaragua, I also hold a lot of privilege, right? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that and how power and privilege plays out in those spaces. What I'm going to most focus on is my work with the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centers. And so I'm not currently working with them, but my previous work with the OFIFC, that is what it is for short, I was a trainer with them, and I worked primarily delivering what was called the Indigenous Cultural Competency Training for social service providers, healthcare workers, school boards, educators. And so, what it was essentially sharing what Indigenous history is in Canada through an Indigenous lens. And it entailed pieces that we don't necessarily learn in the current curriculum, the current school education that exists in Canada. I also worked with the Indigenous Youth Council across Ontario, and I worked as a trainer providing training for Friendship Center staff. So if you don't know what a Friendship Center is, in Toronto, you have the Council Fire, which is a Friendship Center. You have the Native Canadian Center, which is on Bloor and Spadina. And, those are friendship centers. And so essentially they are community hubs for urban Indigenous folks that provide culturally relevant and culturally responsive programs from cradle to grave. And they also offer programs, they host events, they offer programs for non-Indigenous folks as well in terms of so for example, Indigenous cultural competency. And so they are spaces, that are focused on culturally relevant and culturally responsive programming for urban Indigenous folks. But as non-Indigenous people, you can definitely connect with them and attend their events, support their markets, things like that. So, that is one small step to learning and building allyship. And so that is the main work that I want to focus on. With the friendship centers, I was able to support them in knowledge and skill building to support them in being able to support their communities. So I'm going to talk a little bit about informed allyship. And, we've been hearing about allyship and partnership and the importance of those pieces, right? I think allyship in general can be a pretty loaded term. And I think that's the importance of this conversation, right? If we want to call ourselves allies, how, what actions are we taking that prove that we actually are? And how can we have it so it's not performative allyship, right? And I think that's a really important piece. And how do all of those pieces that we learn, especially, if most of you are studying right now and we are learning theories around power and privilege, around oppression, around equity, diversity, inclusion, right? We are learning all of the frameworks and the language that's involved in that. And then how do we translate that into action, right? And the reason I talk about informed allyship is because I'm going to talk a lot about reflecting on our own identities. I'm going to talk about how we, learn. It's about learning about other communities and their histories as well. And so I think Samya talked a lot to these ideas, and I'm going to continue speaking to those and further them. So I'm going to focus on, right, what I'm focusing on is working across cultures and identities. And a really important piece that we need to start from is just by our own personal reflections. And so it's been spoken to a couple times today, but understanding what is your social location? First of all, what is your positionality before you start to work with other communities, right, that you don't necessarily share identities with. And so Samya shared the power flower activity. So this is this wheel of power and privilege. It was also it's kind of a evolution of that power flower activity, right, where it talks about, right, power in the middle. And then that first circle there, the types of identities that we all hold. And as we move out from there, right, the identities that are more marginalized, whether it's under gender, citizenship, skin color, formal education, ability, sexuality, neurodiversity, mental health, body size, housing, wealth, or language, right? And those are just a few of them. Of course, these lists are never exhaustive, right? Things that might be missing are religion, geography, right? Like rural or urban. And so this is just one way to visualize our powers and our privileges that can, that we have in spaces. And so I know Samya asked you to reflect on that a little bit earlier, but I'm going to ask you again to reflect on it and pop into the chat. Choose any of these identities, whether it is, somewhere between 1 and 5 of these identities, and share in the chat box if you're comfortable. You can message me directly privately if you feel more comfortable that way, and I can uplift your answers anonymously. Right, what are some of your identities on this wheel, whether they are identities of privilege or marginalized identities? So I'm going to give you a moment to pop those in the chat. And I want to leave it up on the screen as you do that. So I can share with you, of course, so for me, in this wheel, right, I'm a citizen, I'm a Canadian citizen, I hold a Canadian passport. I would say that I am female, right? So in terms of gender, I am a cisgender woman. English, right? I hold a position of power there. I have post-secondary education. I am skin color, I would say, right, like there's the different shades to dark, right? As an Asian person, Samya talked about shadeism, right? I'm probably a lighter shade for that, but I'm not, I'm non-white, I'm a racialized person. I do own property. And so, right, like in this wheel of power, I definitely, hold a lot of places of privilege, right? Thank you for sharing in the chat, male and straight, but racialized and disabled, right? So we all hold different positions of power, but also we also hold identities that are marginalized, right? And so with that, reflecting on that idea, and it's important to think about, the identities that we hold. Where do I hold privilege? Where do I experience marginalization, right? And how do those dynamics show up in the spaces where I'm working or the folks that I'm working with? And so that's the important piece of having that self-reflection. How do they show up in the spaces where I'm working, right? For example, like for me, when I was working with Indigenous community, right, I hold various places of power because I am non-Indigenous. However, I am racialized, right? Post-secondary education, not all of my colleagues had post-secondary education. At the same time, right, working in an Indigenous context, what is the value of knowledge and what does knowledge look like, right? And so that was also, kind of tying into what assumptions do I have? What assumptions might others be making about me, right? In terms of, if we talk about assumptions, is post-secondary knowledge or training, does that hold more value than Indigenous ways of knowing, right? And I would say no. And so, but those are the types of questions that we need to ask ourselves. When we talk about intersections of lived experiences, right? So while I'm not going to center my own experiences of racism and oppression, perhaps when I'm working with Indigenous community, I think that they are still important and valid because those experiences of mine, they help me relate to the experiences of others. When working with Indigenous community, specifically when working with Friendship Center staff, right, and delivering trainings, I'm able to have very candid conversations with folks because I have an understanding, I can very much relate to what it is like to have a loss of language and a loss of culture for very, very different reasons. I have loss of language, through the generations in my family, and some disconnection to culture, and so I can relate to that with some of the Indigenous folks that I'm working with. And also really important to acknowledge that those reasons are very, very different, right? And so those understandings and intersections of lived experiences are important. So it's important to reflect on these pieces of ourselves. And, those are strengths that we are bringing to the table. As well, it's important to reflect and learn shared histories. So not only is it important to understand and learn the history of the communities that we are working with or that we want to work with, it is also important to understand where have those histories intersected, right? So for example, historically, there are many friendships that existed between Chinese community, especially those who, for example, came to build the railroad. And then shortly after the railroad, Chinese communities, Chinese immigrants were very marginalized and, not allowed in a lot of spaces. And so, there are many stories, and this was the same for Indigenous folks. They were not allowed in many spaces or welcomed in a lot of spaces. And so there are many stories of allyship from those years and friendships. So being welcomed, for example, the Chinese restaurant in a small town might be the only space that welcomes Indigenous folks. Not to say and not to romanticize that I'm sure racism and conflict happened between the two groups as well. However, we also need to know and learn about those other friendships that existed, right? And so learning those shared histories as well. When I am working with communities that I don't share identities with, I want to make sure that I am reflecting on what is my role. And so if I am identifying as an ally in the work or the support that I'm providing to another community, right? What role am I being asked to do? What role have I chosen to do? What role maybe have I been hired to fill, right? As a trainer with the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centers, for me, it was being able to, being trusted with sharing Indigenous history in Canada through an Indigenous lens, right? It was material that was developed through an Indigenous lens. It wasn't my material. And, having the trust of the organization to be able to deliver that material and also carry some of the emotional burden of educating about that oppressive history. Because for a lot of my colleagues, that is their personal history. Sometimes they would share personal stories. And so it was really important that, I am there and I'm able to carry that emotional burden, right? And especially when I'm co-facilitating with somebody in times that are tough, that is really important. And so I also want to talk about, right, we had to talk about what is my responsibility. I see you, Jen, thank you, right? As a racialized settler, learning and understanding that I am a visitor, right? Learning about the land and area I'm on. So as I spoke about in the land acknowledgement piece, right? Learning on my own accord. Samya spoke to this around how do we, we need to learn about these communities, but it's also our own responsibility to learn on our own accord and not necessarily be learning on the backs of those folks who are already marginalized, already oppressed, right? And one of my managers that I worked with, this is always sticks with me. We hear this idea of like knowledge is power, right? But it's important to actually think about knowledge as responsibility. When I have those pieces of knowledge, when I have the knowledge that I'm learning now or in school or across lived experiences, what is my responsibility to do with that knowledge? I also want to point out practicing humility. So, going into pieces with a beginner's mind, challenging what we thought were truths, right? Overcoming maybe shame or guilt that we hold certain pieces of privilege, or that we don't have the understanding that we think we should have, right? Privilege, guilt is a real thing, right? So we need to work through that. And finally, relationship and trust building, right? So the main lesson that I always came back to from the work that I did with the OFIFC, and I currently still do work with Indigenous communities across Canada, mostly in Western Canada now, because I live out west, but is relationship and trust building, and that it takes time to build those relationships. And we have to have the understanding of history of mistrust in systems, in institutions, and mistrust of others. And so being able to kind of like walk that journey through that is important. And so with the few minutes that I have left, I'm interested to know, what fears or concerns do you have about working as an ally? So you can either pop into the chat box or you can unmute yourselves. You can raise your virtual hand if you need to. What fears or concerns do you have about working as an ally? My other questions that I do have as well are, what skills and knowledge are you learning to overcome those fears and concerns? Or what actions can you take to be able to work in allyship across communities? So potentially that people won't feel safe disclosing hardship because they think I won't understand in my position of privilege, or that I will accidentally say or do something that's re-traumatizing. Thank you for sharing that. Fear of misrepresenting or misunderstanding other people's positions or identities. Yes, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I think absolutely. And so, to both of those, what skills or knowledge, are you taking away from the speakers today that might help you to overcome those fears? Or what actions can you take to be able to work through those pieces? One piece, absolutely. I think as hopefully you are responding to that in the chat, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Learning about the communities and clients I'll be interacting with, and always listening and letting their experience speak, like Alan said. Yeah, absolutely. Ongoing learning and communication with allies. Yeah, for sure. For sure. And I didn't speak to it necessarily, but listening, right? Our role in the beginning is listening, for sure. And that, building those relationships, I think the piece I was just going to speak to is accidentally saying or doing something that is re-traumatizing, right? So I think it's building that relationship to be able to navigate that and kind of own that piece of where you're at in your learning, and saying, this is what I know now, and this is what my intentions, this is what I know now, and I'm still learning, right? I'm still learning, and that we can, my hope is that we can work together and we can learn about each other. So it's that building relationship and getting to that point where they feel comfortable also bringing it up to you. Hey, like what you said actually, was felt painful and harmful to me. Can we talk about it, right? And so it's also learning how to apologize. And so that is an important piece. And one more comment in the chat, learning to differentiate between proper news sources and the ones that deliver fake news. Also learning to connect with people in those marginalized communities. Yeah, absolutely. So for sure, like finding out where your information is coming from, specifically around Indigenous communities, right? I unlearned a lot of things over my years, because we're not told the histories that we are taught in schools. It's through a certain lens, right? And so it's important to understand, who is telling the story of what we are learning. And one last comment here: even if we have the fear of not fully understanding a community, sometimes even just giving them someone else they can rely on and speak with is important. So if I'm understanding that correctly, right. So being a person that they can just, being a reliable person, being able to build that relationship and build that trust with them, I think is what I'm hearing in that. So thank you, everybody.
Brought to you by the Chinese-Canadian National Council for Social Justice and made possible by TD Bank and the Government of Canada. Thank you for watching.